Hello and welcome to the last session of the series on the web of life. We started by trying to understand why we need to think differently about our relationship with life and the environment around us. To help us in this process, we've been exploring the systems view of life framework. We then tried to understand our food web, food systems, and our relationship with the environment in our towns and cities systemically. Now, in this last session, we will continue with the systemic examination and see how it can help us be resilient as we navigate through the numerous changes and uncertainty that the future holds for us. Okay, so let's begin by understanding the meaning of a word that I just used, resilient, or rather resilience. What is it? So, resilience, to put it very simply, is any system's ability to bounce back from a challenge. For instance, when you fall ill from an infection, your ability to recover, that is how quickly you recover, how well you recover, is a function of your immunity, which of course is a function of your food habits, your overall fitness, and your genetic constitution. So as a result, a reasonably healthy person has the capacity to fight the infection and also bounce back more easily, or what we can say, the person is more resilient than say someone who is malnourished or has compromised immunity because of disease, etc. Extending this understanding to life and the planet, there are a few things we need to consider. For life systems to be resilient, right, they need to have the capacity to adapt to changing conditions, so to reset themselves so that they can survive, and not just survive but also flourish in the new conditions. Then the next thing to remember is that their flexibility can help them there. And what is flexibility? The ability, the skill, resources to quickly make changes which will allow them to adapt. Then there's one more factor, right? How does this flexibility happen? How can you bring about this flexibility? This often comes when there are a variety of options or ways to navigate the situation. This is what we call diversity, that variety, right? We have a plan A, we have a plan B, we have a plan C, then we can manage challenges, isn't it? So let's, as usual, take an example. When a farmer grows only one kind of crop, and if the crop gets hit by drought or pest, they lose everything, right? But if they grow 3 or more diverse crops that are native to a given area, then the chances of getting an income or food are much higher, because even if one plant gets hit or one crop gets hit, there are 2 others that may survive. Let me take another example. Now, so for example, if I want to get from my home to some place, and I know of multiple transportation options, right? I have my own vehicle, or I know that there is a bus service which will take me, or there is a metro or an auto rickshaw. Then even if my vehicle breaks down, I can get to that place, right? So both the farmer or I, we need to know about these options. The farmer needs to know, or he needs to know how to grow these multiple crops, needs to have the seeds of these diverse crops, needs to have the resources to grow them. I need to know, these multiple options. In fact, I need to know how to access these multiple options, right? I need to know, where my nearest bus stop is, what bus number will take me there, or which metro will take me there, right? So we need to have knowledge, and we need to have some experience as well. So to build resilience, we need adaptive capacity, which comes from flexibility, and that flexibility comes from diversity. So that's sort of the connection, right? Today we actually have enough evidence that human activity is transforming the environment and life on the planet in very profound ways, and it is creating many changes that are irreversible. In fact, the August 2021 report that has come out from the from the IPCC, which is the body that reports to us on the status of climate change, they have been telling us very categorically, hundreds of scientists have worked and presented scientific evidence to show us that human activity is the single largest driver of change on the planet. Now, this has thrown up a lot of challenges and a great deal of uncertainty for the future of life. While we build resilience to cope with this, we also really need to find ways to reduce the impact of our actions to minimize the magnitude and the severity of the transformations that we are causing. Now, in thinking about resilience and minimizing our impact, let's articulate explicitly, right, some ideas and concepts that sort of were implied in our earlier discussions, right? So let's take these explicit articulations first. Whether it is global warming, loss of diversity of flora and fauna, or the deep socio-economic inequalities that we are seeing in our lives and in our cities and towns, they're all driven by how we access and use our environment, what we call resources. You know, earlier we had talked about how carbon dioxide emissions are causing global warming. But if we look behind these emissions, what are they? They are but a byproduct of how we consume energy sources, isn't it? And of course, we need energy for everything that we do today. The second point is that the way we use resources, whether it is energy, water, land, animals, plants, labor, is very tightly linked with economic growth. You know, growth, aging, death, they're all part of the cycle of life. The issue here is the way modern society has chosen to grow and develop economically and socially, highly resource intensive and unfettered and continuous economic growth. Now, the third point here that we want to put out there explicitly is that this growth is based really on explosive consumption, because you know, the way we measure our growth and development, the indicators we use are based on explosive consumption. Now, growing human population grows, and which means that it uses more resources, right? But more than population, it is the unequal patterns of consumption. Now, that is a cause of most of the changes that we are experiencing. And what is happening is that this excessive consumption by certain sections of society, so by itself, this excessive consumption is creating pressure on resources. But it's also doing something else. It is setting the aspirations for others, which means it's driving others' consumption patterns. Then there are others who don't even have access to the bare necessities of life, right? So this is something that we really need to understand, these connections, right, between growth and consumption, the kind of growth that we have embraced. Now, the growth of human civilization, and we've talked about this earlier as well, is deeply entwined with energy. So what did we do, you know, when we started, when the Homo sapiens actually existed? We used fire. Then we shifted to human energy. Then we shifted to animal energy. Then we brought coal, oil, gas, and of course today we have renewable energies. But interestingly, we use all of these resources even today. We still use human labor. We still use animal energy for various things. And of course, coal, oil, and gas dominate our lives. And all this has taken human civilization and human society to extraordinary heights. But that has come at a very steep cost to all the very same processes that sustain life on Earth, you know, both human and other life. So you see, there is this economic growth, consumption patterns, resource extraction, linkages, right, which very clearly illustrates to us how economic, social, and ecological systems are inextricably connected. When we understand these relationships, we learn about the critical points where change has happened. That is when we see things systemically. Once we understand where the change has happened, we know where we could provide actions or where we could respond so that it can have the most long-lasting impact. So let me say this again. You know, through a systemic view of life, we're able to see these relationships, and through that, we're able to learn about the critical points where change has happened. And if we address those critical points, we actually can have a long-lasting impact, provided our response and our actions allow for life to be sustained, right? Now, the systemic view, what does it do? It unravels to us the underlying structure, not just the individual pieces of the system. then it also allows us to focus on interactions, on cycles, on flows, on patterns, rather than simple individual events that we talked about in the beginning. We saw this in our exploration of the food system and the cities. And like I said earlier, it also helps us identify what some people call inflection points, so that we can make changes at those inflection points, and interestingly, we get outcomes that are desirable and can be sustained. Right? So these inflection points are very interesting, because sometimes when we make suitable changes and responses there, the outcomes can be much larger than we anticipated. So it really depends on what changes you make so that you get outcomes that are desirable and can be sustained. And what do we mean by desirable? That life is sustained. All life is sustained. So this notion of systems view and relationship that we are discussing here, by the way, is not new to human thinking. You know, it's been an integral part of cultural traditions and indigenous ways of life, where human beings are seen as part of the web of life and not apart from the web of life. Okay? And they continue to live with this worldview even today. Now, apart from culture and indigenous societies, scientists have recognized this. In the 1970s, as many of you may know and you may be familiar with, the Gaia theory, which was put forth by James Lovelock and Lynn Margulis, two scientists. And what does that Gaia theory propose? It proposes that all organisms and their inorganic surroundings on Earth are closely integrated to form a single and a self-regulating complex system. And what does the self-regulating complex system do? It maintains the conditions for life on the planet. This was, of course, rejected in the 1970s when it was first proposed. But there is more and more evidence today to support it. And increasingly, it's become an integral part of our thinking and also of studies. Now, moving from this larger picture, let's look at some things we will need to be ready for as individuals and communities, re-examining the choices we make and our consumption patterns. Now, as we discussed in the food system example, right, we must become aware of where all that we consume comes from and how does it get to us. So for that, what will we have to do? We will have to look for information that helps us understand this network of relationships. Once we have that information, we then have to equip ourselves with the ability to find diverse ways of being and living, so that if one fails, another one is available, and we can adapt it to new situations. We also need to rebuild our relationship with our environment. You know, for example, as individuals, we can really get involved in ways to save, say, for instance, the green spaces in our neighborhoods, conserve water, try and buy food as much as possible locally from vendors and open markets, build social relationships and sustain them so that we can collectively engage with governments and local bodies and be part of a democratic decision-making process. Now, knowing all this, right, the next step, of course, is to find ways to prepare ourselves and the next generation to be resilient. We talked about resilience in the beginning. Now, uncertainty and change, they are an inherent part of all life and life processes. But it is the new sources of uncertainty that are the challenge. And what are they? They are related to climate change and, of course, the outcomes of how we as human society proposes to adapt to them, how we choose to respond to them. And the second challenge is the developments in artificial intelligence and biotechnology. The historian and author of the now very famous book Sapiens and then Homo Deus, Yuval Noah Harari, he points out that uncertainty is likely to come from technology which enables us to engineer bodies, brains, and minds, which is what we're talking about, this combination of AI, artificial intelligence, and biotechnology. You know, many things that seemed almost like it was a law of nature, you know, how our bodies are, how they function, even that may change. This means that our relationship with the environment and other living beings is also likely to change, isn't it? Then there's another issue, right? The enormous amounts of information that we are getting, we're flooded with it actually. We need to know how to make sense of it for our existence. To me, actually, this means that we need to start with our education system so that the next generation is aware and to some extent equipped with that adaptive capacity that we were talking about earlier. This education is not just in schools, but in all the environments where we engage and relate as living beings. You know, some of the essential skills really include the ability to make sense of information, to be able to differentiate between what is important, what is not. And we just talked about that. Most importantly, though, we need to be able to put all these pieces of information together and to understand where is the world now, what is the state of the world. Because once we understand that, then we can respond suitably. We also need a lot of mental flexibility to respond, and also the ability to be emotionally balanced in the face of this uncertainty. So now, as we come towards the end of this session, let's see what can we take away from this session, and also from the larger series that we've talked about. One is, of course, that uncertainty and change is a part of life, right? The difference now is that a lot of the present and future uncertainty, to a large extent, has been caused by human activity. It will come from how we adapt to climate change and how we use artificial intelligence and biotechnology on a large scale. Now, to cope with uncertainty, we need to build resilience at various levels. Individual levels, community levels, national, region, global levels. Right? We need to collaborate. We need to come together. We need to sustain the diversity in life forms, social systems, livelihoods, food systems, how we plan, build, and maintain our cities, towns, villages, how we meet our essential needs. And like I said earlier, we have to do this collectively. We have to collaborate. There is no one way to live or to be. And we saw that in the example when we were talking about indigenous cultures. And we know this from our conversations about food system and urban centers that we talked about. So let me emphasize again that there is no one way to be or live. Diversity will help us build flexibility and the capacity to adapt to uncertainty, which in turn will build resilience. And here I'd like to once more show you that systems approach that we talked about, the nested systems, just to remind us of that framework. And through the systems view of life, we can understand the network of relationships both within the system, across systems, which can then help identify crucial points or inflection points where changes will likely produce outcomes that are desirable and can be sustained. There are no prescriptions of what to do and what not to do, right? But what the series intended to do was to get us to think about our environment and to see the human species as one part of it and not apart from it. I hope the series provokes you to think about where we are today, how we got here, and how can we contribute to building societies and relationship that sustains all life. Thank you very much.